right, welcome back to the episode where we're talking about the profitability math behind how to make sure your practice is profitable. So in the last episode, we talked through how to understand your overhead, your break-even point, and now we're going to talk a little bit about profit per patient and then kind of dive into compensation. So again, last episode we talked about, I think it was Riverside Medical. They bring in $4 million in revenue. They have $2.4 million in overhead, and they have 6 people equating to 5 FTEs, right? Because those 2 APPs were each a half FTE each. So again, that's basically take that $2.4 million divided by 5 in order to get that $480,000 in cost to cover overhead. So each one of them, each one full FTE, again, the APPs are kind of splitting this, but each full FTE has to cover that $480,000. Again, there's different ways you can do this. I think I probably made it a little confusing last time. I would not include your variable expenses. So, your supplies, your vaccines, the things that go up for every single patient. I would include things like billing, staff, keeping the lights on, rent, and that's your staff salary, not your physician or provider salaries. We're going to talk about that today. But your overhead and your variables, we're going to kind of talk about those. In the first episode, we were really just talking about that overhead expenses, not including any of your lab supplies or vaccines or other things that increase on a per patient basis. And so we'll talk about basically how to understand if your physician is covering their own cost, right? Their salary, covering their share of overhead, and then if there's anything left over to provide for a bonus or how much profit you're making off of these. Then that will also kind of give you ways to structure compensation so that it's motivating, but also still profitable. So really, really important that you can take away growth targets for on a how many people do they need to say from a per patient basis per day, so that you can then set realistic targets for marketing, so that you can set realistic targets for your physicians, for your APPs, so that you can think through ramp up times, right? It's going to take you 6 months to get to that break even point, or are you striving to get them break even in the first month? Again, there is no right or wrong answer to this. It's just how do you want to handle profit? And then if you do give them a ramp up time, right, can your other profit cover the expenses of that physician, right, from the other providers that you have in the practice, or are you taking it out of your own pocket, or are you having to get a loan? Again, no right or wrong answer. I know that this is difficult, but it is something important for you to understand. And all right, so let's do a quick kind of clarification, right? So we talked about overhead, rent, utilities, EMR subscriptions, front desk and billing staff salaries, or if you have like a percentage, like an outsourced, include that in there. Insurance, any more admin fees, kind of that stuff that doesn't really change based on patient volume. Again, the labs, vaccines, test kits, if you have lab in-house, those are your variable supplies. Understand what that is on a per patient basis. You can do an average, right? So 50% of your patients get vaccines, or 50% of your patients get a lab test. Just understand what those costs are. And so for this example, right, we had that $2.4 million per year split around those 5 people. We had $480,000 in overhead per full-time FTE in your revenue generating position. So each physician or your providers. Now let's go back to our example, right? So each visit at Riverside generated $150 in collections. Now say you have variable costs, lab supplies, credit card fees. There's only $10 per visit, right? Say you don't have a lot. Say you don't have a lab. It's just like some gloves, credit card fees, I don't know, some other tongue depressors, those sort of things in the lab, in the office. So let's just say on average, that's $10 per visit. So what you're left with is $140 left per patient to then cover overhead, physician compensation, and profit. So this is our magic number, right? So $140 left to cover all of that information. So now we can start to understand how many patients does it take to cover that $480,000 is their overhead, their portion of overhead. Say you want to give them $250,000 of salary, benefits, and malpractice, right? Kind of bucket what, is all grouped in there. Don't forget about benefits. Don't forget about malpractice, kind of any of those little things that go into what their comp package is. You'll want to know that. So then how many patients per day will cover their share? So let's go back to our example, right? So let's talk first to cover overhead. So $480,000 divided by 140 gets you, they need to see 3,428 visits per year just to cover their overhead. Now, in over 240 clinic days, it's 14 patients. Now, next, let's go and cover their compensation. Let's see if this is doable, right? Because I think we said we were going to give them a $250,000 comp, which may be wildly too much for this clinic, but we're just using it for example case. So $250,000, again, that's their full comp. So that's not just their salary, but the salary, benefits, which is typically that 20% range, and then malpractice. So they're not taking home that $250. But say that's their comp package. Divided by $140 per patient visit, right? Because that takes away our variable expenses. That's left with another 1,786 visits per year, which equates 7 patients per day. Again, we're using that 240 clinic days. So now already we're at 21 patients per day to cover their overhead and to cover their compensation. And so 21, 22 patients per day. So we're already at a point where that could be a full load depending on how you see patients. Now, some practices can see 30, 35, 40 patients a day. That's cranking. Just depends on your subspecialty, depends on your patient mix. But so this is what kind of starts to build out. Okay, we need 14 patients per day to cover their share of the overhead. We need 7 patients per day to cover their salary or their entire compensation model. So that's 22 patients. Now, anything above 22 patients is then profit for the practice. Now, you can decide, okay, I'm going to give them a portion of that profit. I'm going to give them 20, 25% of that profit so that we're aligned to the same goals. And you may, if these physicians and providers are normally seeing 35, 40 patients, you may be able to do that, right? If you're saying, oh, well, my expectation is for them to see 25 patients, then we need to reduce some expenses. We either need to reduce our overhead or we need to reduce our compensation package for the physician. And one of those two things has to give, or we don't give a cut of the profit. I mean, these are kind of the decisions you have to make. I'm a big fan of giving folks a cut of the profit, because it aligns you to the same goals. It aligns you to growth. So for example, this Riverside example, right? Physicians seeing 22 patients a day isn't just busy. They're basically just covering for themselves. And there's no point in just hiring somebody just to cover themselves, unless it's just taking a load off of you. And that's enough for you and that's enough for them. And that's it. But if you're trying to run a growing, profitable business and you have the patient volume, obviously, to cover more than that, or you can go out and hunt for more patients, that's going to help you add margin and cover their expense and so forth. Now, I've kind of, talked about this a little bit, but, structuring provider compensation is going to depend on all of this math, because then that becomes, a tool to figure out, you're not just guessing, right? So we're going to talk about kind of the 3 structures we've seen in private practice that we see in our practices, right? So straight salary, right? Predictable, stable, no performance incentives. Basically, you carry all the risk. You, the CEO, cover all the risk, because if they fall short of their productivity metrics, you're going to struggle and cover it. You're basically going into your own pocket to cover. Again, you may make the decision that I can't get them busier than that, or that is what the market is, but I don't want to see those patients. And, again, that's not how I would decide to do it, but you guys all know your market. But you just have to recognize that if they're falling below that mark, right, you are paying them out of your pocket in order to cover them being in the office. Model 2, which is what we see most often, is a base plus productivity. So again, that base covers their break-even floor. So in this example, it's 250. And again, this included malpractice and benefits. So take those in. Now the bonus only kicks in after they've covered for their salary, plus they've covered for their overhead. Got to cover both of those buckets. Plus we've already counted for variable expenses. So all of the expenses are in there, because your variable expenses were that $10 per patient. Your salary and benefits were in the $250, then your overhead was in the $480. So then if a physician earns 25% of their collections above that break-even point and they collect $1 million, then that's where you're going to take that $1 million, you're going to take away their base, right? But then you're going to take away their overhead as well. And then above that, that's where you cut the 25% from. So then you're still keeping the majority of that profit, right? You're the one marketing, you're the one taking the risk, you're the one being the CEO, and that's okay. But then, you just need to make sure that the maths. So the third model, which I don't see all that common, but I could see happening, especially for smaller practices, is to do a pure revenue share, where you say you have no base salary. The physician keeps a set percentage of the collections after covering their share of overhead. So say they collect $1.2 million and overhead is $480,000. The remaining $720,000 could be split, say 40-60, 50-50, 30-70. Again, but the majority is still always going to the practice in most cases, because again, you're the one doing all of the work in order to manage the practice, right? Because it's almost like a management fee. So different ways to kind of skin this cat, but completely self-funding and motivating for entrepreneurial physicians is to make sure that, give them a piece of the cut, right? That's, in my opinion. Obviously, you never want to pay for effort. So I know there's a lot of ways to calculate a compensation. You could do it off RVUs. You could do it off net receipts. To me, I always think it makes more sense to do it off of net receipts, right? Because that's the money coming in the door. It is what aligns to basically all of your accounting systems. It is what aligns to your accounts receivable. So if your accounts receivable or you're having issues collecting patient payments, if you're going off RVUs, you don't get you don't take into account if you do have issues with patient collections. Now, you shouldn't have issues with patient collections, right? We've talked about that in terms of strategies around that, but you do have to push those things. Basically, what I'm recommending is going off of net receipts in order to manage compensation models for any sort of physician. And this just kind of models out how to pull those numbers together. A full schedule does not always mean profitable, and you need profit in order to keep the lights on and to continue to grow your practice. So the other thing, patient volume goals that drive growth. So now let's think about this in terms of a growth plan. So say you want your practice to go from a $4 million a year business to a $5 million a year business. What would that take? So $1 million, again, we're talking gross revenue. So we're not talking with expenses or anything. So again, each patient brings in $150 per visit. So if you're trying to bring in an extra $1 million, that's essentially bringing in 6,667 more visits this year. So if we were to take that and divide it by the 240, that's an additional 27 patients per day in order to hit that $1 million. And again, that 27 patients could be to one physician, right? You hire another physician, you've got an extra room, you've got the marketing pipeline to get those additional 27 patients per day in the door. Great. Push, right? Open the patient room, get the physician full, and there you boom, you've got $1 million more in gross. So when you start to think through and work backwards in these numbers, then you can think through, okay, how do I get 27 patients per day? Okay, well, if I go and talk to 10 neighboring referring practices that each give me 2 patients a week, how many of those referral practices do I need in order to increase to that, 6,600 patients per year? And so then you can start it back through. Okay, well, if I have marketing efforts, if I have referral practices, if I talk to nursing homes, wherever you're getting your patient volume from, you need to find those levers and find how many patients, per week, per year that you're getting from each of those referral sources to get to that 6,600. And again, this is the CEO math that folks need to get used to doing, because this is what drives decisions. This is what drives volume. This is what drives successful practices. And I so often see many of our practices where the physicians don't have the CEO time, right? They're seeing patients 5 days a week. And I get it. It is very difficult in a small practice to have the time and energy to get these things done. But unfortunately, you have to carve out the CEO time. So in the beginning, that may be Saturdays. I think this is a Sunday and I'm recording. So, you as a CEO, you may work more on the weekends in the beginning, and that goes away. Or you may decide, I want to micro practice. I want to work 3 days a week. I'm going to keep my expenses so small that I can work 3 days a week and still have a profitable practice. And there's many great physicians who have done it that way, but you've got to know what your expenses are and keep those as small as possible so that you can have the profit you need in order to pay yourself. And really, really important just to kind of know these numbers. Again, you don't need to be an expert in finance, but you do need to have a team around you who is. Obviously, this all takes into account that you have a good accounts receivable, you have reduced denials, you have reduced eligibility errors. Because if you add in all of that, it's going to decrease that gross revenue. And this is all going to get even more difficult, right? That $150 per patient goes to $110 per patient because you're not collecting all you need to collect. So this enables you to look back 12 months is what I would recommend to get that average patient per or receipt per patient, receipt per visit, so that you know that number, because that's an important number to know. That in this case was $150. Now, if you switched billing companies or you've done some other things, maybe you're pushing that to $160 per patient visit. Great. Use that once you know that those changes have been made and you're seeing those numbers on average. So really, really important, I think, to kind of think through this in order to drive marketing, to drive growth, to drive, is my physician or provider covering for themselves? And if they're not, what is going on, right? Do they think that they're busy and they can't take on any more patients? Or do we not have enough new patient leads coming in to fill the seats? What can we do? Can we call patients and say, hey, I haven't seen you this year. Do you want to schedule an appointment? Or, hey, we haven't had a follow-up visit about your XYZ. Do you want to be seen? Calling those referral networks. I mean, there's a lot of different mechanisms by which you can grow patient volume. That's not our expertise. I'm kind of the numbers person. So highly recommend listening to the podcast Entree MD. Dr. Uno is amazing when it comes to marketing and so forth. So really, really important kind of knowing these numbers so that you're not guessing and that you're not paying for physicians and providers. One other thing to comment before we leave is, okay, so say you're bringing somebody on, and again, say you know that they need to cover themselves at 22 patients a day, right? I think that was our number. But say in the beginning, they're only 2 patients a day. Hopefully that's not the case, but you know that they're not covering for themselves. And so what is the ramp period to get them to 22 patients a day? Is that a month? Is that 3 months? Hopefully, you're not hiring until you know that you can securely book, 22 patients a day fairly quickly. So again, you're not spending 6 months paying for them out of your pocket. Having a good ramp up period is normal. It's average. It's normal to have a ramp up period, but you just don't want to have that go on forever. So come up with the time period. Now you may have a wait list and you know that you can get them to 15 patients a day pretty quickly. And that with some additional marketing between now and the time that they're credentialed, you can get them where you're already booking their schedule before they've even started, so that they start, that first month getting as close to that 22 patients per day, ramping up to that 30, 40 patients or whatever it is. And again, we used an example of $480,000 of overhead. Maybe your overhead is much less than that for 5 FTEs. And that's a thing to think through, right? If you're looking at your practice and you're going through this example and you're thinking to yourself, I actually am not covering for our physicians are not covering for themselves, then what are your 2 levers, right? Your levers are going to be revenue, right? Can we see more patients? Or expenses? Can we decrease our expenses? Where can we cut expenses? Or are you not collecting, right? Is there a collection problem, right? So do we have an AR problem? Do we have patient AR, insurance AR, denials, eligibility, right? All of this math connects. As you guys know, we are a full service medical billing and coding company. So if you are making over $150,000 in net receipts every month, head on over to our website. You can click a free audit, and we will do an audit for you guys in the sense of billing metrics. I don't typically go into this detail with practices for consulting arrangement, but we are working on a tool that you can put in your numbers and understand profitability. So we'll be sharing that hopefully in the next couple of weeks. All right, I think it's a lot of information. Go check out the blog too, which will help kind of, if you're a visual learner, really know your numbers. You can hire more confidently. You can pay strategically, invest in the marketing and precision to grow a company based on knowing exactly, what a patient brings into your practice. A lot of practices run on instinct. They don't have the time or not making the time in order to run these numbers. Really, really, really important. All right. As always, if you like this episode, share it with a friend. We're hoping to continue to, share the knowledge that I think we really didn't get enough of in medical school and residency. So share it with a friend. All right. Have a great rest of the week.